Christine Brown did not change everything by being louder, more demanding, or more emotional. She changed everything by stopping. Stopping the arguments, stopping the explanations, stopping the constant effort to make herself understood inside a system that had already decided how much understanding it was willing to offer. At first, that change was almost invisible. There was no dramatic announcement, no explosive confrontation, no moment where everything suddenly broke. Instead, there was a subtle shift in energy, and that shift mattered more than any argument ever could. For years, Christine was not quiet. She spoke openly about feeling lonely, she talked about wanting more connection, she expressed frustration, sadness, and disappointment. These were not isolated complaints. They were patterns, and patterns reveal intent. Christine did not fight because she enjoyed conflict. She fought because she still believed effort could lead to change. That belief is important. People only fight when they think something is still salvageable. They argue when they hope to be heard. They repeat themselves when they think clarity will finally produce action. Christine's fighting was not chaos. It was hope. Hope that the structure could adjust, hope that fairness could be restored, hope that emotional effort would eventually be reciprocated. But hope has limits, and when hope repeatedly meets the same outcome, it transforms, not into rage, into clarity. Over time, Christine began to notice something that could no longer be ignored. Her words were being acknowledged, but not acted on. Her feelings were being heard, but not prioritized. Her pain was being discussed, but not relieved. Conversation replaced correction. That substitution is exhausting, because conversation gives the illusion of progress without delivering it. Each time she explained herself, she had to reopen emotional wounds. Each time she tried again, she invested energy that was not returned. That imbalance matters. When one person repeatedly does the emotional work while the structure remains unchanged, the cost accumulates, and eventually the cost becomes too high. Christine reached that point quietly. She did not announce that she was done fighting. She simply stopped. That stopping was not indifference. It was decision. A decision formed slowly through repetition and disappointment. She had already asked the questions, already waited for answers, already seen the outcomes. By the time she stopped fighting, she was no longer reacting emotionally anymore. She was concluding. Another reason her stopping mattered so much is because of the role she played inside the system. Christine was not peripheral. She was central. She contributed emotional energy, connection, and effort. She tried to maintain warmth and cohesion even as the structure grew colder. As long as she was still trying, the system could lean on that effort. Her fighting acted like a buffer. It absorbed imbalance, it softened neglect, it filled gaps where structure was weak. That buffer allowed everything else to keep functioning. When she stopped fighting, that buffer disappeared. And without it, the system had to face its own reality. This is why stopping fighting can be more disruptive than confrontation. Confrontation keeps engagement alive. It keeps emotional investment present. Stopping removes it. Christine's shift exposed how much emotional labor had been required to keep things moving. It also exposed how unevenly that labor had been distributed. Once her effort was gone, the imbalance could no longer be ignored. Another crucial change was in her tone. Earlier, her words carried urgency. They carried longing. They carried the desire to be chosen. Later, her words became measured. Not cold, clear. Clear speech does not seek permission. It states reality. By the time Christine stopped fighting, she was no longer trying to convince anyone of her worth. She already knew it. That internal validation changed everything. Because when someone stops needing to be validated by a system, that system loses its power over them. Christine no longer needed reassurance to stay. She needed honesty to leave. That honesty did not come with shouting. It came with acceptance. Acceptance that the structure was not going to change in the way she needed. Acceptance that patience had become a permanent expectation. Acceptance that continuing to fight would only prolong her own depletion. Once those truths were accepted, fighting made no sense. Why fight for something you no longer believe in? Why argue for balance when imbalance has proven itself structural? Christine did not stop fighting because she stopped caring. She stopped fighting because caring without change had become harmful. That distinction is critical. Stopping was not giving up. It was choosing herself. And when someone who has been holding things together chooses themselves, everything shifts. The system cannot function the same way. Christine's stopping did not cause immediate collapse. It caused exposure. Exposure of how much effort had been masking dysfunction. Exposure of how dependent the structure had been on her emotional labor. Without her fighting, there was no one left to cushion the truth. The truth that patience had replaced partnership. The truth that endurance had replaced equity. The truth that silence had become the price of staying.
Once she stopped fighting, the story was no longer about repair. It was about inevitability. Because systems built on one person's continued effort do not survive when that effort is withdrawn. Christine did not force change through conflict. She forced it through absence. Absence of argument, absence of justification, absence of emotional cushioning. And absence is powerful. It reveals what effort was hiding. Her stopping did not escalate tension. It clarified it. It showed that the relationship had been sustained not by balance, but by her willingness to keep trying. When that willingness ended, the reality became unavoidable. Christine's choice did not need drama to be decisive. It needed honesty. Honesty with herself first. Once that happened, everything else followed naturally. The shift was quiet, but its impact was irreversible. Because once someone stops fighting, they are no longer negotiating. They are leaving. And that is why Christine Brown stopping the fight changed everything. Not in one moment, but in a way that made every moment after it different. This was only the first layer of that change. What followed would show how stopping the fight didn't just transform her own path, but reshaped the entire structure around her. When Christine stopped fighting, the first thing that changed was not the relationship itself, but the emotional balance inside it. For years, she had been carrying a disproportionate share of the emotional weight. Not because she was required to on paper, but because the structure quietly depended on it. She was the one who voiced discomfort, the one who tried to initiate difficult conversations, the one who named problems before they became unavoidable. That role matters. In any long-term system, the people who speak up early are often doing unpaid emotional labor. They are not creating problems, they are identifying them. But when identification is met with reassurance instead of repair, something shifts. The message becomes subtle but clear. Your awareness is noted, but not acted on. Over time, that message trained silence. Christine reached the point where she no longer believed that further explanation would lead to different outcomes. That belief, or rather the loss of it, is what truly ends effort. Once effort stops being strategic, it becomes wasteful, and Christine stopped wasting herself. Another quiet change was how the emotional rhythm of the relationship altered. Earlier, there was tension followed by discussion followed by hope followed by disappointment. That cycle repeated enough times to become predictable. Predictability removes urgency. When disappointment becomes expected, it stops provoking reaction. Christine didn't stop fighting because the pain disappeared. She stopped fighting because the pain had become familiar. Familiar pain doesn't incite conflict. It incites exit. But before exit comes distance, and distance arrived quietly. She shared less, she explained less, she reacted less. This wasn't withdrawal meant to punish anyone. It was self-preservation. Each time she chose not to engage, she conserved energy she had previously spent trying to fix something she no longer believed could be fixed. That conservation mattered, because it allowed clarity to grow. Without constant emotional engagement clouding her thinking, Christine could finally see the situation without urgency. She could observe patterns instead of reacting to moments. Patterns don't lie. They reveal whether change is temporary or structural. What she saw was not a series of misunderstandings. It was consistency. Consistent imbalance, consistent disappointment, consistent explanations without correction. Once someone sees consistency clearly, they stop treating problems as negotiable. Negotiation only makes sense when outcomes are uncertain. Christine no longer felt uncertain. Another important shift was how responsibility began to move. Earlier, Christine carried responsibility for communicating, for maintaining harmony, for smoothing over friction. Later, she released that responsibility. She stopped trying to manage how others felt about her feelings. She stopped shaping her words to make them easier to receive. That is a significant change, because emotional labor often involves pre-editing yourself to reduce discomfort for others. Christine stopped doing that. Not aggressively, simply quietly. She spoke less, not because she had less to say, but because she no longer needed to say it. This also changed how conflict functioned. Earlier, conflict was emotional and raw. Later, conflict barely existed. Not because things improved, but because Christine no longer believed conflict would produce growth. Conflict requires belief in repair. Once belief disappears, conflict feels unnecessary. That's why stopping the fight is often the most decisive action. It signals the end of negotiation. Christine's calm created discomfort not because it was dramatic, but because it removed leverage. As long as she was fighting, there was still something to respond to. Her calm offered no such opportunity. It was not an invitation to discuss. It was a boundary. Boundaries don't argue, they redefine. And once boundaries are in place internally, the external world eventually has to adjust. Another thing that changed was how Christine related to time. Earlier, she waited. She waited for improvement, she waited for consistency, she waited for promises to materialize. Waiting keeps people emotionally invested. When she stopped fighting, she stopped waiting. She no longer structured her future around the possibility of change. She began imagining life without that expectation. That mental shift is profound. Because once someone can imagine peace outside a system, staying inside it becomes optional. Christine didn't rush that process. She allowed herself to sit with it, to test it emotionally, to see how it felt to no longer center her decisions around endurance. What she found was not fear, it was relief. Relief doesn't provoke arguments. Relief ends them. Another subtle but powerful change was how she interpreted silence. Earlier, silence felt heavy. It felt unresolved. It felt like something was being avoided. Later, silence felt honesty. It reflected what was already true. That honesty made fighting feel undecisive by comparison. Why fight for a version of reality that no longer exists?
Why perform emotional labor for an outcome you no longer want? Christine's stopping revealed something essential. The fight had never been the problem. The fight had been the glue. As long as she fought, the system could pretend it was still alive. Once she stopped, the illusion faded. The system did not collapse immediately, but it began to lose coherence because it was no longer being emotionally reinforced. This is the part people often misunderstand. Stopping fighting is not the end of caring. It is the end of sacrifice without return. Christine still cared. She simply stopped paying a cost that was no longer sustainable. That decision didn't announce itself loudly. It didn't need to. It changed the energy in the room. It changed expectations. It changed the future. And once that shift occurred, nothing could go back to how it was before. The fight was over. Not because she lost, but because she chose not to keep participating in something that demanded too much and gave too little. This was not the end of the story, but it was the point where everything became irreversible. Because once someone stops fighting, they stop negotiating their worth. And when worth is no longer negotiable, everything else begins to realign around that truth. As Christine stopped fighting, the impact didn't show up immediately in obvious ways. It showed up in what no longer happened. There were fewer emotional check-ins, fewer attempts to clarify misunderstandings, fewer moments where she tried to bridge gaps that had existed for years. That absence was not accidental. It was intentional restraint. For a long time, Christine had been the emotional translator in the relationship. She tried to explain not just what she felt, but why she felt it. She tried to soften her pain so it would be easier to receive. She tried to make her needs sound reasonable instead of urgent. When she stopped fighting, she stopped translating. She allowed the reality to exist without cushioning it. That change was unsettling, because the system had grown used to her doing that work. Once she stopped, misunderstandings were no longer smoothed over. Discomfort was no longer preemptively managed. Emotional gaps were no longer quietly filled. And without those buffers, the imbalance became visible. Another critical shift was how Christine began to relate to disappointment. Earlier, disappointment was something to process, discuss, and resolve. Later, disappointment became information. Instead of asking, "How do we fix this?" she began asking, "What does this tell me?" That reframing is powerful. When disappointment becomes information instead of a problem to solve, people stop trying to fix the environment. They start deciding whether they belong in it. Christine began observing patterns rather than reacting emotionally. She noticed how often effort flowed in one direction, how often reassurance was delayed or absent, how often explanations replaced action. Those observations didn't provoke anger. They produced clarity. And clarity removes the emotional urgency that fuels conflict. Another thing that changed was Christine's relationship to hope. Hope had once been her motivation to fight. Hope that conversations would lead to change. Hope that effort would eventually be matched. When she stopped fighting, hope didn't disappear overnight. It transformed. It shifted away from the relationship and toward herself. Instead of hoping things would change,
she began hoping she could feel at peace. That internal redirection matters. Because when hope is no longer invested in fixing something external, conflict loses its purpose. You don't argue for peace. You choose it. Christine also stopped framing her needs as requests. Earlier, her needs were presented as things to negotiate, as compromises to reach, as adjustments others could make if they chose to. Later, her needs became boundaries. Boundaries are not invitations. They are statements. And statements don't argue. This didn't make her cold or distant. It made her grounded. She no longer needed to convince anyone that her feelings were valid. She accepted them as such. That acceptance changed how she showed up. She became calmer. Not because she cared less, but because she was no longer waiting for permission to feel differently. Another subtle but important change was how Christine responded to inaction. Earlier, inaction created frustration. Later, it created confirmation. Each moment where nothing changed reinforced what she already knew. That reinforcement removed doubt. Doubt is what keeps people engaged in cycles of argument. Once doubt disappears, cycles break. Christine's calm was not resignation. It was certainty. Certainty that the relationship was no longer aligned with who she was becoming. Certainty that continued fighting would not produce a different outcome. Certainty that her energy was better spent elsewhere. That certainty made her presence different. She was no longer leaning forward emotionally. She was standing back. And when one person steps back from a dynamic they once carried, the entire dynamic shifts. The system begins to wobble. Not because something new is happening, but because something essential has stopped. Christine's withdrawal of emotional labor exposed how dependent the structure had been on her engagement. Without her fighting, unresolved issues stay unresolved. There was no longer someone pushing them into conversation. They simply existed. And unresolved issues don't disappear. They accumulate. That accumulation created distance. Distance does not provoke fights. It creates separation. Another reason her stopping fighting changed everything is that it altered the power balance. Earlier, her vulnerability had been accessible. She shared openly. She expressed pain. That openness created leverage. Once she stopped offering it, that leverage disappeared. Not as punishment, as self-protection. She no longer made her pain available for discussion without resolution. That choice protected her. And it also revealed something else. The system did not know how to respond to calm disengagement. It could respond to emotion. It could respond to conflict. It could respond to urgency. But it had no response for quiet certainty. Christine's calm did not invite repair. It marked an ending, even if that ending had not yet been spoken aloud. By the time she stopped fighting, the decision was already made internally. Everything after that was timing. Timing of acceptance, timing of readiness, timing of action. This is why stopping fighting is often mistaken for peace. It looks peaceful, but it is actually resolution. Resolution that has already passed through grief, anger, and hope. What remains is movement. Movement away from something that no longer fits. Christine did not announce that movement loudly. She didn't need to. The absence of fighting said everything. Because when someone stops fighting, they are no longer asking to be understood. They are preparing to leave. And once preparation begins, the outcome is no longer in question. It is only a matter of when. This was the stage Christine had reached. The stage where the decision was no longer emotional. It was practical. And once decisions become practical, they cannot be undone by conversation. They unfold. Quietly. As Christine's decision solidified internally, the effects began to ripple outward in subtle but undeniable ways. The dynamic no longer revolved around repairing tension. It revolved around managing distance. Where there had once been emotional back and forth, there was now space. Where there had once been repeated attempts to reconnect, there was quiet acceptance of disconnection. This shift did not happen because Christine stopped caring. It happened because she stopped compensating. For years, she had compensated for absence with effort, for imbalance with patience, for neglect with understanding. When that compensation ended, the reality underneath became visible, and that visibility changed everything. One of the most significant changes was how conversations felt. Earlier, conversations carried emotional charge. They were heavy with expectation. They carried the hope that something meaningful might finally shift. Now, conversations felt lighter but emptier. They lacked urgency. They lacked